I evacuated my family to Russia and went to Donetsk, where I provided assistance. Later, I moved between Donetsk and Luhansk, helping with the referendum process. Leonid Kravchuk, who was the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine in the Soviet Union, turned out to be a former Banderite himself. After the USSR collapsed, he openly boasted about it. A Welsh speaker differs from a Londoner far more than a Ukrainian differs from a Russian.
Presidents of 3 Baltic states were all American citizens. Thomas Hendrik Kilius in Estonia, Vaira Viki Freiberga in Latvia, and Valdas Adamkus in Lithuania. They were the descendants of not Banderites but the so-called Forest Brothers, local nationalist insurgents who fled the Soviet Union, settled in the United States, became citizens, and built their careers. Then, at the right moment, when the Baltic republics gained independence, they were sent back to rule these countries.
Let them keep it. Let the true Ukraine exist somewhere in Canada. We have no objections.
That's true.
Yes, that will be great, by the way.
For Zelensky and his inner circle, peace is a death sentence.
Zvezda Holding presents Dynamic Spectrum Talks. Now.
Здравствуйте, друзья, это программа... Hello, friends, this is Dynamic Spectrum Talks podcast, where we build bridges between countries and peoples looking for common ground. Above all, we try to better understand each other. My name is Anna Shafran, and next to me is my colleague Yuri Lindra. Со мной мой коллега Юрий Линдра.
We welcome you all. Today's broadcast will be slightly unusual, as we will be talking specifically about politics, and not just any politics, but that which is a serious irritant in the relations between neighboring states and peoples who were once united. We will talk about the kind of politics that divides people who now find themselves on opposite sides of the border. If we take Russia and Ukraine as an example, and to help us understand this better, is our guest. Today is a very interesting one and unusual. Meet Alexander Rogers, a journalist and writer. He's originally from Ukraine and has lived there for a long time, witnessing many dramatic events from our recent past, which can be considered as a shared history. For this reason, we believe that Alexander will help us unravel the complex of events that has brought us to the point where we are now, to find ourselves on opposite sides of the political barricades. However, the people still maintain the commonality that has traditionally existed between us for centuries.
That is correct.
Alexander, we're happy to welcome you to our studio.
Alexander Rogers, hello.
Hello.
Please tell us your story. As Yuri mentioned, you were born in Ukraine, lived there for a long time as a citizen of Ukraine. Could you tell us a bit about your background?
Western Ukraine.
Not
Yes,
quite Western Ukraine.
Not Western Ukraine.
Some people mistakenly think Vinnitsa is Western Ukraine, but it has always been considered Central
We will
Ukraine.
keep that point in mind. Now you live in Russia, but your surname doesn't sound very Ukrainian, nor is it exactly Russian. It was once thought to be a nickname. However, you recently published a photo of your passport online, and it clearly states Alexander Rogers. What is this rather unusual surname? Who are you exactly?
I would say it's written in Cyrillic script in a white paper.
Well, my ancestors are from the Oriol region, and the other were originally Czech, from Prague. Though, if you dig deeper, they came from Normandy in northern France. But for the past couple of centuries, they have lived in the Czech Republic.
And how did they come to visit Vinnitsa?
Well, my grandfather moved there. Yes, my grandfather, Leonid Alfredovich, and his father, Alfred, moved to Vinnitsa.
So, essentially, a regular Russian guy, Alexander Rogers.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Alexander, how did you feel growing up knowing you were born in Ukraine, but didn't exactly fit the stereotype of a typical Ukrainian? You were originally from the USSR, but after its dissolution, the situation has changed. How did this affect your upbringing and worldview? How did your perception of identity change over the time in Ukraine?
It's quite simple for me. I was born in the Soviet Union, and I considered myself a Soviet citizen. I still do. To me, all the republics were, despite all the upheavals, part of the same country. I felt for the people. It's quite simple for me. I was born in the Soviet Union, and I considered myself a Soviet citizen. I still do. To me, all the republics were, despite all the upheavals, part of the same country. I felt for the people during the earthquake in Armenia, for instance. Everything that happened to these people was part of my people. So, there is nothing strange about it. My grandfather served in the NKVD, and my other grandfather was a war correspondent. So, I'm also a Soviet person, and I don't relate to the values promoted by modern Ukraine.
Just to clarify, the NKVD is often stereotypically perceived as a punitive body, but in reality it was the current equivalent of the Ministry of Internal Affairs or police.
Yes, the police force.
Police, yes.
After 1946, when it was transformed, my grandfather worked in law enforcement.
So he was actually a defender of the law.
Yes, he was catching criminals.
So how did you become a journalist?
Well, to be honest, I don't really call myself a journalist. I see myself more as an expert, an economist and political analyst. My background is in economics. I worked as a strategic analyst, and whenever I had unused materials, data, calculations, I would write them up in my blog because it seemed a shame to discard them. Over time, I started drawing conclusions from them, and that's how I got into writing and public commentary. And there I am, 18 years later, still doing it.
How did you, as an adult, experience the events of 2014? How did you perceive the changes in Ukraine, especially as someone from a neighboring, historically close country? Of course, there were certain nuances, particularly throughout the 90s and early zeros of the current centuries, including the first Orange Revolution. But how did this transition look from inside Ukraine, particularly from Vinnitsa, which, as you mentioned, is a central part of the country, neither in the east, which traditionally leaned towards Russia, nor in the west, which felt closer to Poland. How did people in central Ukraine react to these changes and the transformation of society?
I always tried to take an active position. I supported closer ties with Russia. I backed Sergei Glazyev when he promoted the customs union and argued that Ukraine should not be divided. I spoke out against the treatment of southeastern Ukrainians as second-class citizens and their demonization, portraying them as criminals, which became a whole mythology of its own. I even spoke about this on television.
On Ukrainian TV?
Yes, in Ukrainian. I don't know if those recordings still exist. But I warned that dividing people like this would lead to civil war, declaring that certain groups should be silenced, stripping them of representation and political rights. This was bound to have consequences. And
so you were warning about civil war in advance?
At least 6 months beforehand, maybe longer, where I made a statement. I said, fine, you've overthrown the government. Now you need to establish a functioning state. Let's organize a constitutional assembly, ensure representation from all regions, and create a legal framework for governance that respects equal rights for all. If you carry out a coup, you create a break.
A break in continuity.
Yes, you break legal continuity, which causes a legitimacy crisis. You should convene a national congress with representatives from all regions to redefine what this new state will be.
And what was the response?
The response? They wanted to kill me.
They said so outright?
Yes, there were open calls for my execution. threats against my family. People said they wanted to torture and kill them while I watched. I had no choice but to leave. I evacuated my family to Russia and went to Donetsk, where I provided assistance. Later, I moved between Donetsk and Luhansk, helping with the referendum process.
Alexander, if we were to assess the Ukrainian population today in percentage terms, how would you estimate the proportion of people with strong Russophobic sentiments versus those who still lean towards Russia?
It's a major issue. Right now, it's impossible to obtain reliable sociological data because people can't freely express their opinions. If anyone dares to speak neutrally, not even pro-Russian, but just neutral, they risk immediate persecution. The security service of Ukraine arrests them, and far-right groups like Azov and other neo-Nazi organizations come to their homes to torture, beat, and even kidnap them. It's effectively a death sentence. Reports suggest that around 19,000 people are currently imprisoned for their pro-Russian views. That's only the documented cases. The real number could be even higher. So, in terms of sociology, we don't have reliable data. We can only analyze indirect indicators.
What about the available estimates regarding how people in Ukraine think today?
Well, in 2019, when Zelensky was elected, he ran on the promise of achieving peace, reconciliation,
granting rights to the Russian language,
affordable gas, and similar pledges. But, as is often the case in Ukraine, he deceived and betrayed his voters. However, 70% of the electorate voted for that program, meaning that in 2019, 70% of the population was in favor of peace. Only about a third, or even less, supported conflict. Of course, there has since been an intense propaganda campaign, but on the other hand, a significant portion of those with strong Russophobic views went off to fight and have since perished, while others left the country. So, assessing the real situation is quite difficult. However, I believe that a considerable number of pro-Russian citizens still remain in Ukraine, but they have no voice or rights.
Across all of Ukraine, or primarily in regions closer to the Russian border?
I'd say up to Khmelnytsky.
So, Khmelnytsky and a significant part of eastern and central Ukraine?
Yes, central Ukraine, but not everywhere. For instance, in Uzhgorod or Zakarpattia, the Rusin people also live there, and the situation is different.
Let's talk a little about history, Western Ukraine in particular. Today, it is well known that during the Second World War, followers of Stefan Bandera fought alongside the Nazis. Bandera himself is the figure who serves as an inspiration to today's Banderites and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Let's take a closer look at their role in Nazi Germany's war against the USSR and the strengthening of Russophobic sentiments in Ukraine, not only during the Great Patriotic War, but also after during the Soviet era under Khrushchev and in modern times.
The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army were initially not created against Russians. They were formed to fight against the Poles, and in fact, they were established by the Austrian General Staff, just like Ukrainian nationalism itself. Stepan Bandera was an Austrian subject and engaged in subversive and terrorist activities. He carried out bombings and assassinations of Polish ministers and officials. After 1940, when Western Ukraine's territorial status changed, Bandera's role shifted. When Austria became part of the Third Reich, he was redirected. Initially an Austrian intelligence agent, he later came under the command of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. intelligence.
So he submitted.
Yes, he fell under the Abwehr's control and started working for Nazi intelligence. His entire organization followed suit, shifting its focus to fighting against the Soviet Union and Russians. They played a key role in major atrocities, such as the Volhynian massacre, where they slaughtered Poles and Jews, and the Lviv pogrom, which targeted the city's Polish, Jewish, and Russian populations. They were also involved in the Babi Yar massacre and acted as executioners against the Belarusian people. The infamous 200th Battalion, responsible for burning down villages in Belarus, including the Katyn massacre, was under the command of Roman Shukevich. Essentially, the Banderites were behind many war crimes committed against civilians.
After the Great Patriotic War, these individuals were pursued by the Soviet authorities and condemned at the Nuremberg trials. However, as we see today, their ideology has been revived.
Скрывающихся бывших нацистов выискивали. Как мы видим, все это
How has this legacy survived and even expanded in the modern era?
уже в наше время.
Unfortunately, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev halted all persecution of the Banderites and fully rehabilitated them, allowing them to infiltrate government structures. They used a tactic known as entryism, where one person would enter a position of power and then pull in their associates.
So infiltration?
Exactly. One Banderite would get a government position, then use it to bring in more. Eventually, Leonid Kravchuk, who was the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine in the Soviet Union, turned out to be a former Banderite himself. After the USSR collapsed, he openly boasted about it.
Будучи главой коммунистической партии Украины в составе Советского Союза, значит, он как бы бывший бандеровец тоже был. И он этим уже после распада Советского Союза активно хвастался.
Was this known during the Soviet times, or did he hide it?
Сложный вопрос. Наверное,
it's unclear. He probably hid it, as he was a minor at the time and didn't engage in combat. He was more of a courier, delivering supplies to the insurgents.
Yet this movement slowly infiltrated the entire state agencies.
At first, they occupied key positions, and from 1991 onwards, they systematically expanded their influence in government, education, media, and culture, essentially shaping the nation's consciousness. If denazification happens, these sectors will be crucial to purge. They prioritized roles in education, particularly literature and language teaching, as these is where identity is shaped.
Это очень важно будет вычищать именно эти сферы. То есть в первую очередь это сферу культуры, сферу образования, значит, то есть и выше, там, и в том числе они любят быть учителями литературы, там, учителями языка, значит, украинского, там,
History teachers.
People who shape and lay the foundations of self-awareness. And of course, this doesn't happen in mathematics.
But let's reiterate, during the elections, when Zelensky and Poroshenko were competing, 70% of the Ukrainian people voted for a relatively healthy agenda. Hopefully, Zelensky will follow through on it. But what was happening with the state agencies? It was, in effect, a soft occupation by Bandera supporters.
Well, not exactly soft.
In
it was
places.
rather harsh in places. Yes, in places. Take 2014, for example, when members of the National Council on television and radio broadcasting were simply thrown out of their offices by Banderites using physical force. And it wasn't just there. Many other institutions were taken over in a similar manner. It was essentially a forceful seizure of ministers.
They did seize them, but if we look at it retrospectively, the process was gradual. Over time, they reached their desired level of control.
In fact, this is how Ukrainization progressed in the 19th century. It was largely driven by the Polish intelligentsia, who changed names and surnames. Lesia Ukrainka, for instance, was not actually Lesia Ukrainka, just as Panteleimon Kulish was not really Panteleimon Kulish. The same applies to others, like Kotsubinski and so on. Essentially, they were minor Polish nobility, many of whom were recruited through the Austrian General Staff. They were involved in the theater circles. They were school teachers, and they promoted their ideas in similar ways. They began distorting the language, starting with Kotlarevsky's Aeneid, which was originally more of a satirical piece. From there, the narrative of a supposedly distinct Ukrainian language began. But in reality, a Welsh speaker differs from a Londoner far more than a Ukrainian differs from a Russian. The pronunciation was still classical, but now they are actively modifying it. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was no standardized Ukrainian language. It had to be invented. That's why figures like Kuleshov and Skripin each introduced their own linguistic standards. There was no established language. It was all created on the go.
So essentially, an entire industry was working to construct a distinct identity, not necessarily one of exclusivity, but one that would separate these people from the larger family to which they actually belonged.
So Ukraine is not Russia then?
Exactly. Right now, we are seeing the same thing being uncovered, just as USAID was doing. They have been funding and supporting various initiatives for decades, nurturing elites, promoting cultural programs, and pushing specific agendas. It's exactly the same strategy.
Yes, exactly. We are discussing how Ukrainian nationalism and Banderite ideas took root over decades in Ukraine. But one important aspect we may have overlooked is the role of Ukrainian immigration. Many Banderites followers managed to escape, often with the help of so-called allies during the Second World War and under the anti-Hitler coalition. Many of them settled abroad, particularly in Canada. For example, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is a direct descendant of the such Nazi collaborator from the Second World War.
Как-то прямым потомком одного из таких вот деятелей нацистского толка периода Великой Отечественной войны. Вот как вот это
How did this Ukrainian immigration, which established itself comfortably abroad, contribute to supporting and shaping nationalist sentiments in the present day Ukraine?
на территории современной Украины?
Almost all of them were either founded or controlled by Western secret services. After 1945, the Abwehr transferred its entire network of agents to the newly established CIA under Alan Dulles. As a result, all of these Banderite operatives came under the direct control of the Central Intelligence Agency. Many of them lived their entire lives this way, working for Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and similar organizations. They wrote so-called Ukrainian language textbooks and engaged in various propaganda their efforts. Some of them also carried out subversive activities, established contacts with their relatives in the Soviet Union, and engaged in recruitment efforts. Essentially, for 3 generations, they did nothing but wage a war against the Soviet Union and later against Russia.
So they were deliberately raised for this purpose?
Yes, the second and third generations followed exactly the same path. Take Zbigniew Brzezinski, for example. He was a professional Russophobe who knew nothing else in life but hating Russia. And now his son is doing exactly the same. The pattern repeats itself. These people developed an ideological hatred towards Russians, whom they blamed for ruining their careers and forcing them into exile. Moreover, they had a financial incentive, spreading propaganda, fabricating narratives, and lying became their profession.
That's exactly why I asked. There was an interesting historical precedent not long ago, perhaps unique in this nature, when the presidents of 3 Baltic states were all American citizens. Thomas Hendrik Ilves in Estonia, Vaira Viki Freiberga in Latvia, and Valdas Adamkus in Lithuania. They were the descendants of not Banderites but the so-called Forest Brothers, local nationalist insurgents who fled the Soviet Union, settled in the United States, became citizens, and built their careers. Then, at the right moment, when the Baltic republics gained independence, they were sent back to rule these countries. The result? We ended up with highly hostile states on Russia's borders, countries that are not only joined the EU but also NATO. To this day, along with Poland, they remain the most aggressive anti-Russian actors. So, understanding how deeply entrenched such sentiments were among Ukrainian immigrants is critically important. Fighting neo-Nazism and the Banderite ideology within the Ukraine and its newly integrated regions is one thing, but there is another part of this issue that we, unfortunately, cannot reach. Would you agree? Would you agree?
Well, yes, they do exist abroad, but their influence is somewhat limited. If they are pushed out of Ukraine and left to exist elsewhere under the patronage of yet another Western backer, so be it. From a practical standpoint, it would just be a waste of resources on their part.
But they will remain the keepers of this ideology, ensuring that it does not disappear.
Let them keep it. Let the true Ukraine exist somewhere in Canada. We have no objections.
That's true.
Yes, that will be great, by the way.
All the most radical patriots of Ukraine have long since left the country. The same applies to the younger generation. If you look at today's most unspoken fighters, many of them are members of band organizations, like the leader of the S-14 group Karas or the leader of the Odessa nationalist movement Sternenko. They are all in Poland now, sitting in Warsaw, collecting donations. As it turns out, the so-called S-14 group was also founded by USAID. So, on one hand, we have supposed humanitarian programs, and on the other, a direct connection to neo-Nazi groups.
Well, never mind, they fed the agents. Is also recognized as a terrorist organization in Russia.
There isn't a single terrorist group in the world that they haven't founded by USAID.
Такой вопрос. A question about Maidan. After the events on Maidan, you went to Donbass, supported the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, and began reporting from there as a journalist. What did you see? And most importantly, would you describe what Kyiv did to its own citizens as genocide? В отношении собственных граждан геноцидом.
I saw a lot. For example, they claimed that there were dangerous separatists there. But in reality, at the checkpoints, I saw people with nothing more than sticks and wooden clubs, completely unarmed. If armed nationalists had arrived, they would have slaughtered them instantly. This resistance started with ordinary people who simply stood up for themselves. themselves.
So it was a truly spontaneous grassroots movement.
Yes, entirely organic. The leadership of the Party of Regions has fled. They were busy trying to secure a future for themselves elsewhere. The people who took to the streets and organized resistance, the first leaders of the republics, were not professional politicians. Bolotov, Nikitin, Zakharchenko, they all came from outside politics. They were ordinary people who stood up because no one else would. At first, they simply wanted to assert their rights. There was no separatist agenda in the beginning. They were asking to be allowed to speak Russian, to manage their own affairs, to federalize Ukraine. Then came the events in Odessa, where people were burnt alive. That was the moment many realized they could no longer be part of this. It wasn't just about people dying, it was the way they died, and how their deaths were celebrated on television. That was beyond comprehension.
You mean live broadcasts were used as a warning to others?
Yes, and in TV studios, people were clapping, laughing, and making jokes about it. They joked that the fire was a great barbecue. It was outright barbarism. There is such a thing in Shintoism. Killing is sometimes unavoidable, but no one should ever celebrate it. Yet here, they were openly rejoicing over the deaths of their own fellow citizens. These were not outsiders. They were residents of Odessa. I myself almost became one of them. I had the option of going to Odessa instead of Donetsk. And after that event, there were no more choices left. Even though Putin urged restraint, on the ground there were no alternatives left. The only solution was separation. Personally, I always argued against the idea that we were separatists, as Kiev claimed. On the contrary, we were unionists. We wanted to reunite with our homeland. The real separatists were in Kiev and western Ukraine. They were the ones who had broken away from our shared history.
That logic makes perfect sense. It's unfortunate that this perspective isn't widely discussed, even though in reality it's the only logical way to look at things.
There is an expression that fits here. If you take control of a land where the people speak a different language, follow a different faith, and live by different laws and traditions, then perhaps you simply occupy the wrong land.
Especially if you have to rename cities, change street names, tear down monuments, and rewrite history.
But coming back to the question of genocide, would you use that term to describe the actions of the Kiev regime against Donbass?
Absolutely. There were countless statements made on television and in the media by Ukrainian journalists and politicians, from minor figures like Drozdov to high-ranking officials such as Shufrich and Timoshenko, openly calling for extreme measures. For example, they spoke about dropping a nuclear bomb on Donbass. Others suggested walling off the region, covering it in concrete and eradicating its population entirely. There were numerous calls for ethnic cleansing, eliminating all Russians and repopulating the area with loyal citizens. For them, it was always about the land, never about the people. The same tactics were used against Crimea.
люди.
blocking electricity, cutting off water supplies, and attempting to create a humanitarian catastrophe that would lead to mass casualties. What would have happened if Crimea had been left without water? People would have died slowly, painfully, from thirst. This is a crime against humanity, yet the entire Western world simply turned a blind eye, pretending nothing had happened.
It is the classic case of he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. That explains why nobody in the West seemed to care. But, Alexander, after all these years of resistance in Donbass and the attempted genocide, Russia eventually launched its special military operation. Do you think this was an inevitable step, or were there alternative options? Was it necessary to carry it out in the way it was done?
There were several key factors. First, Russia officially recognized the republics and signed a mutual defense treaty with them.
And a mutual assistance agreement.
Yes, mutual assistance. This meant that in the event of an attack on the republics, Russia was obligated to intervene. On the 22nd, the document was signed. By the 23rd and 24th, over 1,500 shells had already been fired at Donetsk alone. That was an act of aggression, clear and undeniable. Yet Western propaganda continues to claim Russia's action were unprovoked aggression. This is simply false. The aggression came from Ukraine. Russia's response was justified. Lavrov explained all this in detail, according to international law, including Article 55.
Of the UN Charter?
Yes, including Article 55 of the UN Charter, which allows for self-defense and the protection of allies. In addition, there were multiple incidents where Ukrainian forces crossed into Russian territory and engaged in skirmishes with border guards. Such actions constitute acts of aggression. Casus belli. Later, it was revealed that the West had been supplying Ukraine with weapons long before the conflict officially escalated, preparing for another offensive against Donbass. This would have violated the Minsk agreements, as Ukraine was planning a military operation to retake the region by force. So, while there was a preemptive element to Russia's actions, there were also at least two undeniable legal justifications, making this a fully legitimate act of defense, not aggression.
For the future of the territory once known as Ukraine, could peace talks happen anytime soon? And more importantly, is Kyiv even a legitimate and capable negotiating partner?
И вообще, Киев, он является ли сам по себе субъектной и договороспособной величиной?
Договороспособной нет,
No,
субъектной относительно.
Kyiv has no real sovereignty.
Режим будет при попытке
If any diplomatic process begins, the regime there will resist it at all costs,
Я не хочу кричать, сучить ногами,
throwing tantrums, staging provocations, and trying to derail any negotiations.
потому что для Зеленского ближайшего
For Zelensky and his inner circle, peace is a death
смертный приговор,
sentence.
по большому счету. То есть их
If the war ends,
вариантах
they could be eliminated by nationalist
их
factions
могут уничтожить западные спецслужбы, потому что
or even
много знают.
by Western intelligence
Если он
services,
лишится власти, значит, он тогда, скорее всего, пойдет под...
because they know too much.
Все сценарии, которые в случае мирного разрешения...
If Zelensky loses power,
для Зеленского
he'll likely end up facing trial.
смертью или тюрьмой. Да, значит, поэтому...
Every scenario involving peace leads either to his imprisonment or his death. That's why he is the main party interested in prolonging the war. He will fight on for as long as he has funding, weapons, and human resources left.
Until it loses all its territories.
Yes, that's right.
And regarding denazification, demilitarization is clear, but how, in your view, how should the denazification process be carried out?
This is just my personal opinion, but I believe denazification is impossible without full territorial control. The entire region needs to be placed under administration, with military civilian authorities overseeing a complete restructuring. The education system must be completely reformed. Right now, under the guise of Ukrainian history and literature, schools are teaching an openly Nazi-oriented ideology that demonizes Russia. Beyond education, the cultural sphere and media landscape must also be reformed. If a television network continues broadcasting anti-Russian propaganda 24/7, how can we talk about denazifications? The entire information space needs to be transformed.
Essentially, the entire media paradigm must change.
Yes, the key is to start telling them the truth. For years, they have been systematically and deliberately fed lies. Every word, from beginning to end, has been false. If any truth slips through, it's purely by accident. Perhaps something trivial, like a ground squirrel being born in a zoo. That might be true. But everything else they've been told for over a decade has been an outright fabrication.
In short, there is an enormous amount of work ahead.
Thank you very much. It's incredibly valuable to hear first-hand accounts of these events. Alexander is a publicist, political analyst, and economist, someone born and raised in Ukraine, a former Ukrainian citizen. Your perspective is very important.
You saw everything with your own eyes.
Thank you again for this discussion. Our guest today was Alexander Rogers. This was Dynamic Spectrum Talks podcast. Until next time.
Zvezda Holding presents Dynamic Spectrum Talks. Now.